All right. Right. Well, first of all, thank you very much, David, for a very far-ranging and, as you said to me before, a slightly provocative presentation. And I agree with a lot of what you've said. But I'm going to argue that the answer to the question, do foreign correspondents have a future, is yes. Though I agree, I have some reservations about the term foreign these days. And I think quite a lot of new organizations now talk about diplomatic correspondence, international correspondence, or specific correspondence about the regions which they're covering. But I think, to be honest, the argument about terms is less significant than the debate about the value of the journalism that foreign correspondents do. And I'm going to start by going right back in history to the period when I was a student and when I first became aware of foreign news, which was one of the heydays, if you like, of the classic foreign correspondent. And this is 1968. It's a long time ago, but there were enormous events which showed the end of, if you like, the post-war era and the beginning of a new era. 1968 saw Soviet tanks destroying democracy in Prague, the Prague Spring. They saw a near revolution on the streets of Paris in the May 68 demonstrations. They saw the Tait offensive, where the American public realized for the first time they were going to lose the Vietnam War. And some terrible events in the United States, the murder of Martin Luther King Jr., the murder of Robert Kennedy, seemed to show a country on the verge of a terrible crisis. And at that time, the people who were reporting it were absolutely the people whom David has said in his presentation are the wrong people to trust with with modern news, and I agree with them. But before we look at who they were, let's remember how it was done, because this is a world we've lost. And I'm just going to do it so you understand that the way that foreign reporting was reflected by the technology. You used telephones, you used telex and telegrams. If you shot on film, you had to process it and edit it. There were no satellites, so the pictures had to be hand carried back to a transmission center. Foreign news was almost a monopoly of big newspaper groups and state broadcasters. And that was pretty well skewed towards America, the United Kingdom, and a growing number of countries, perhaps in Western Europe. And foreign reporting was very expensive because you had to move people and equipment around. You couldn't use digital technology at all. And that helps explain this picture, which is a favorite picture of mine from the past, which is, this is a picture of the Daily Express Foreign News Service, 1969. Now, you'll spot three things about them. You'll spot that they're all white. You'll spot that they're all men. And they're all on the telephone. And just by chance, the man on the far right on the telephone was a man called John Ellison, who was the foreign editor of the Daily Express. And he happened to be my father-in-law. So that's why I've got that picture. It's in the family archives. But that goes back to a period where, as I say, the technology and the way in which news was dominated by a few basically transatlantic companies meant that everything David said to you about foreign correspondents and and reservations about them for that period was completely true. There's no debate between us about how completely out of date that is as a way of covering foreign news. So what happened since, and in my period as editor at ITN, I was one of the people who lived through this transformation, is that digital technology swept that world away. We had ENG, electronic news gathering, satellite news gathering, smartphones, social media and citizen journalism, the challenge to the media monopolies, the 24-hour news channels, and the democratization of news, all the things that David's been talking to you in the earlier part of this presentation, have absolutely transformed the way in which we do foreign news, the capacity to work with other people, opening it up to other players, to different voices, and all of that is for the good. And this is one of my favorite pictures to symbolize that. This is Tahrir Square in January 2011. This is the beginning of a revolution. And what I want you to do is focus on the man in the front. Is he a journalist reporting it? Is he a revolutionary taking part? Or is he both? And what the technology has done is it's blurred the distinction between reporter and participant. And anyone who cares about foreign news, anyone who cares about shining light on dark parts of the world, and as we're going to discuss later in this presentation, there are plenty of dark parts of the world, perhaps more and more dark parts of the world as the forces of authoritarian regimes and populism seem to me to be making it harder and harder for independent, objective, impartial journalism to fight its way through in a world dominated by opinion and by prejudice and very often by political control. But that picture tells me in one image the revolution that's taken place. Anybody can be a journalist, anyone can uplink video, anybody can broadcast. So again, I ask you, and I'll be interested to hear what you think that image says. When you see that, do you think this man is reporting the events that are taking part? Or is he part of those events? Or is he both? So this technology has resulted in a huge range of opportunities for international journalism. And I'm going to call it international journalism because I agree with David that the foreign correspondent word has some of the wrong connotations. And it's quite interesting that most international news organizations don't talk about foreign correspondents anymore. They talk about international or diplomatic, or they talk about Paris or Middle East or regional correspondents. The first opportunity is that technology had no limits. Our man in Tahrir Square could have uplinked that video straight into a news channel. Secondly, the opportunity has created an enormous surge of social media journalism. I'm sure you watch a lot of it yourselves. Very often when a news story breaks, I turn to the social media feeds first before I turn to Sky News or the BBC, because I know actually that there's going to be stuff first on social media feeds. What I don't know is whether what I'm seeing is true or not. What I don't know is whether I'm saying is misleading or not. What I don't even know is whether I'm seeing is actually the event I'm being told it is. Because one of the problems of social media journalism, as opposed to, if you like, traditional journalism, is at the first stage of breaking stories, you really don't know the credentials of the people who are breaking it. So although this is a fantastic technology, it has huge value, there are some reservations about it. The third great opportunity for international journalism, and particularly for international correspondence, is as a result of the expansion of international news. Partnerships in news gathering are now the norm. When I was editor of ITN, we had partnerships with broadcasters and broadcast partners, with freelancers, with stringers, all over the world. No possible way could a company like ITN cover the world with 6 bureaus and maybe 3 international correspondents. It's ludicrous. And David is right that there is a problem of somebody turning up in a country with very little background and thinking that they're going to be able to become an expert in 5 minutes. They can't do it. They have to rely on collaborative relationships and partnerships. And the other reason that this is a great opportunity for a reform of the way in which international news is covered is the growth in local recruitment and much greater diversity in the sort of people who are covering international news. If you listen, and I'm sure a lot of you do, to the BBC World Service, you'll know that, for example, the BBC, which is one of the biggest news organizations, international news organizations in the world, is also one of the most trusted international news brands, has taken a clear decision that it will internationalize or localize, as it were, its bureaus. Its bureau chiefs, many of its chief correspondents, are from the regions that they're covering. It's no longer the case that people are being parachuted in from W12 to be the chief correspondent. And on top of that, that process is now feeding back the other way. I mean, if you take a great journalist like Aline Maqbool, who was hired by the BBC to cover events in Pakistan and elsewhere in the subcontinent, where he has real expertise, very fine journalist, very good reporter in the region he knows well. Where's he working now? He's the Washington correspondent of the BBC. So the local recruitment and the opening up of the whole international news space has resulted in far greater diversity. David is right, it hasn't gone far enough. Media organizations are not perfect organizations. The world is not a perfect organization. I have to say, if you want to be professional journalists, you have to get used to the fact you're working for imperfect organizations and you're reporting on an imperfect world. That doesn't excuse the fact that there's more progress to be made, but it does explain that the fact that progress isn't perfect shouldn't make you throw away a traditional international reporting, which is really important. The other opportunity is this concept of always on. The notion that news is something, it's no longer something which is an appointment of view, it's part of people's lives the whole time. I'm sure you, like me, flick on your mobile phone from time to time in the day to see how something has moved on. And news organizations have had to react to that. So the notion of the sort of grand correspondent who turns up and writes one brilliant piece and then disappears, or produces one epoch-making film and then retires for a well-deserved drink, it's not like that anymore. They're filing all the time. Indeed, some people feel that one of the dangers of the always on technology is that what the foreign correspondent, the international correspondent, does best, which is a really well thought through piece of journalism, can sometimes be undermined by the fact that they're spending half their time feeding two ways to the news channels or writing update pieces for newspapers. The other thing that technology has done is it's enormously increased the impact of global brands. You can have any news you want on your mobile phone. You can have any radio station you want on your mobile phone. Global digital satellite channels now set the news agenda in many parts of the world. We talked in the early days when I was editor of ITN in the 1990s, we formed an alliance with a company called CNN, which a lot of people sneered at. The American networks called it chicken noodle news because they were based in Atlanta, they weren't based in New York. And they created a concept of 24-hour international news, which meant that when they broke a story, and we're going to go on in a moment to talk about the Bosnian camps, which is a story which ITN did, but which actually CNN put around the world, these stories can actually have an immediate political or strategic impact on the way people think about stories. And so the impact of global brands has made international news far more important than it ever was. My men in suits in the Daily Express could write for one newspaper. At that time, 1969, the Daily Express was a great newspaper. It sold 4 million copies a year. 4 million copies a day. Nowadays, it's a sad shadow of itself. And I doubt if many of you read it much, or even if at all. But what happened on a newspaper office in London one morning didn't have a resonance right across the world. If a story breaks on CNN or on BBC World or on Fox or on CBS or any of the major new networks who with their partners straddle the whole world, or the pictures are picked up on the news exchanges like Euronews and the Asian news exchanges, those pictures are seen by everybody very shortly after they've been shot. And we all have to deal with that because that is an enormously powerful force for good, which is why, as we'll see a bit later on, quite a lot of people are trying to curb it and corrupt it and use it for their own purposes. And the final opportunity is that the digital revolution has meant that independent journalism, which you don't find everywhere in the world, which is being repressed and suppressed in many parts of the world, has a chance to break through. And that's enormously important if you believe, as I do, that one of journalism's purpose is to shine a light on the world. So this new world created by digital technology is completely different from the world I described in 1968. If you look at the global news brands, however, you'll see they fall very roughly, and this is pretty rough, but it's not completely wrong, into three sorts of category. The first category are the true global brands: CNN, the BBC. I would say the New York Times because of its web presence, Deutsche Welle, and other European countries. NBC because through Telemundo and Euronews and other partnerships, its pictures and its stories resonate right across Europe and across Latin America. These are the places where international reporting can most make its impact, because in many parts of the world, sometimes illegally, but usually in many parts of the world quite legally, these sources are available to people who want them. International partners, the local television stations, the local newspapers that work with them can pick these stories up and run them themselves. The pictures are on the global news exchanges of the agencies like Reuters, APTN, AP. And so a lot of this international reporting, whereas in the old days it was for a single outlet, it was for the Times or the Daily Express or the BBC domestic service or for ABC or CBA or French television. This material goes global, and it goes global instantly. And it's almost impossible to exaggerate the power, the potential power that those arrangements give to international journalists if they get the story right and if the story has resonance. The second level of news brands are what's happened as a result of the technological revolution, which is all over the world. Countries are developing their own 24-hour news capability. Globo in Brazil, NHK in Japan, Al Jazeera, Arabia in the Gulf. These are ambitious stations who don't just think that they're looking at Brazil or Japan or the Gulf. They have correspondents around the world. They're covering the world with their own interpretations, with their own particular perspectives. And they've enormously enriched the general level of news that's available. And below them, although I haven't shown them, there are national news channels which are more concerned about domestic stories. For example, in India, at the last count, there were over 300 news channels, but they are in the main domestic channels, and a lot of them are very much associated with particular political or commercial interests, but they're enormously influential. And so at the local level, you've got a further culture of local news being done on a 24/7 basis. And then finally, there are the government news channels, because governments all around the world have spotted the power of 24-hour news. And when they don't like what they see in it, they do one of two things, and sometimes they do both. They censor the international channels, they switch off CNN, they block the New York Times website, they ban the BBC. And as well as censoring, they've also decided if you can't beat them, join them. And so we have enormously powerful 24-hour news empires like CCTV and Russia Today, which are paid for by their governments and which do a lot of reporting all around the world. And much of it is good reporting. Some very good journalists work for them. They produce work to a very high standard. But ultimately, their editorial standards and editorial values are set by their governments. So into that environment, where do we go? Well, we go into a world where I hope some of you saw this 2 years ago, of the most astonishing journalistic experiences. This is international reporting at its very best. This is CNN live at the storming of the Hong Kong Legislative Council building on the 1st of July 2019. I saw this material. I was a judge a couple of years ago for the RTS Journalism Awards, and one of the awards is for coverage of a live event, and we all agreed that it was in a class of itself. I hope some of you saw it. If not, you can probably see clips of it still on the internet. But essentially, CNN had live cameras inside and outside the Legislative Council building. They had cameras with the Hong Kong police. They had presenters in the street. They were with the protesters as they broke into the building. It was, as one of my colleagues said, like having a live outside broadcast at the fall of the Bastille in Paris in 1789. It was watching a revolution taking place. Now, of course, we know that it wasn't a revolution. It actually provoked a very severe reaction from the Chinese government. But it was a moment of history. And international news based around a company like CNN with enormous resources, in partnership with local journalists, using all the technology at their disposal, was able to produce a unique ability to see firsthand and judge for yourself what you were seeing. Were these people criminals, as the Chinese government called them, or hooligans? Or were they actually protesters? Were they motivated by malice and vandalism? Or were they concerned about human rights and political rights? You watch the footage, you interview them, you talk to them, you make your own judgment. The great advantage of international news is because it has independence and a little distance, perhaps, from the stories that it covers. It's easier to do what I think is the most important thing in journalism, which is to be impartial. And I don't mean that being impartial as being 50-50 down the line between one argument or another. What I mean by impartial is a journalism that tells people what you, the reporter, is seeing and what is going on, rather than journalism that tells your audience what they need to think. And one of the great strengths of international journalism at its best is it's more focused on telling people what's happened than trying to second guess the audience and telling them, this is what you should think about it. This is what you need to think about it. This is what I think about it, and everybody else has to think like me. That's bad journalism. And you don't see much of that, in my view, among the best international journalists around the world. David asked a good question last night about last night. He said, when did you last see a piece of work that moved you? Well, my answer to the question, I saw it as I saw last night a piece of journalism that moved me, which was Jeremy Bowen in Yemen. I don't know if you've had a chance to view it, but I've got a copy of it. I'm just going to run it in case any of you missed it.
We're heading up towards the front line. We're with soldiers from the army, the government of Yemen. The Houthis, the other side, started a push at the beginning of the year around here. It's really intensified since about September, which has resulted in that big influx of displaced people fleeing from the fighting. people in this camp, it's not the first time that they've had to move. They've had to move repeatedly as the front lines have moved. There are camps, plenty of camps, which have been closed because of military action. They move because they have to get away from the front line that's coming towards them.
ايوه بس قد ابصرنا كل حاجه فجايع كل ساعه لما سمعوا قذيفه ولا طلقات ولا اي حاجه.
So she was wounded. These are pictures of dead people. What lies beneath all of this is the war. War kills people. War makes people move. War creates a crisis. And the way this war ends is not in the hands of Yemenis because big regional powers have intervened. On one side, the friends of Iran. On the other side, the friends of Saudi Arabia, the US, and directly Israel. The people here are suffering because of the fault lines that run right through the Middle East.
Now, Jeremy is, in a sense, exactly what David was talking about. Jeremy is an old, like me, he's an old white journalist. But he's also a very, very good journalist. But he's now been joined in international news by a whole group of journalists who aren't old white men. I just took at random. I just went back over the last 2 years of RTS Journalism Awards, and I thought, well, who was the Journalist of Year last 2 years? Nina El-Baghir of CNN, an absolutely brilliant journalist, was born in Sudan and has covered amazing stories on people trafficking and human rights abuses across Africa. The brilliant Clive Murray, who David knows well, and who is simply one of the best foreign correspondents from Latin America to Africa to the Middle East, has produced some of the most stunning journalism in recent years. And I've chosen them as evidence of the diversity of international correspondence, because I think that actually, when I think about international correspondence, I'm struck that there's a growing, not just a growing recent diversity of international correspondence, but it's always been a part of the business which has been open to talents. When I was at ITN, as I say, we were in a partnership with CNN, and we were two quite small companies trying to cover the world. And our two most important journalists were Trevor McDonald and Christiane Amanpour. And Trevor was born in Trinidad. Christiane was born in Tehran. Sorry, she was brought up in Tehran. Her father's Iranian. And the point about all those four journalists is I do want to have a bit of an argument with David about diversity and who's suitable to cover which story. If you ask, I know Trevor well, I've talked to Clive about this, and I know Christiane well too. I don't know Nina. But I think if you talk to all of them, well, I know if you talk to those three I know, they would say they wanted to be international reporters. They wanted to cover the world. They didn't want to cover any area that their diverse background might make them more suitable to cover. Clive and Trevor, them both made a point of saying they did not want to cover subjects where their background might be seen to be an advantage. They didn't want to cover race relations. They didn't want to cover social issues in the UK. They wanted to be international correspondents and cover the world. And when Trevor first came to ITN, we sent him to Northern Ireland, because that's the first step on becoming an international correspondent, on the basis if you could cover a dangerous and difficult and complex story like Northern Ireland, well, he could go to America and he could end up the man who interviewed Saddam Hussein and Nelson Mandela. And equally, the Christiane with her background could easily have become the most fantastic Middle Eastern correspondent. She didn't want to do that. She wanted to travel the world. And I think international reporting is a fantastic career for everybody. And I really sincerely believe now it's a place where brilliant journalists of whatever diversity, whatever their ethnicity, whatever their background, if they're good enough, they're going to be appointed. And I think if by any chance, I don't think it will happen, by any chance you vote against international correspondence in your essay, and that starts a mass movement that removes international correspondence from the pantheon of journalistic roles, I think that would be a terrible, terrible disaster. But it's not all plain sailing. What we've found in the last few years is that international journalists are increasingly facing threats, not least because of the power of those images, the strength of those stories. There's censorship, there's physical intimidation, the threats to their safety, and you know all that because you've talked to my good colleague at the Safety Institute, Elena Cosentino, about that. And there's threats to resources. This stuff is incredibly expensive. Jeremy Bowen's story looks like, an old white man in a Jeep driving up a road. In fact, the infrastructure to get him there, to keep him safe, working with local partners, working with safety advisors, negotiating with the people who could get him there and get him back, arranging for the satelliting and the distribution of the story. All of this requires an enormous structure. It costs an enormous amount of money. And there are plenty of people who are not just dictators and war criminals who would like to see international news cut back. And they're the people, the money men and the money women in the news organizations looking at the cost of this stuff and saying, we're having to make some cuts. Why can't we cut back foreign news? Isn't it too expensive? Do people really care about what's happening in a camp in Yemen? Maybe we can do a bit less of that. And that's a real threat to international news. And I think it's really important that anyone who cares about freedom of expression gets behind international news and supports it, because it is under pressure. It's easy, and ironically, the things that David talks about, although they're great in many ways, make it easier to make that argument. We don't need a bureau there. We can get stuff from the local broadcasters. Let's close that bureau. Bosnia, which I hope you've seen, I showed you this stuff this piece for a number of reasons. The most important reason is it's a great piece of journalism. But there's a couple of aspects of it I want to explain. We were there with our crews, with our support staff. It cost a lot of money. It took a lot of negotiation to get there. The Serbs made the mistake of letting us in. I think they did not realize, the people who let us in didn't realize what was going on in the camps to the full extent, and they were horrified. And that's why they then had to stop telling a pack of lies that the whole story was a fake. When we were there, I haven't got images of them, but when we were there, as well as our crews, there were two other crews. There were two other crews filming the camps. One of them was a Serb secret policeman, and he was taking pictures, and he's the reason why all the people who we interviewed were so terrified. I'm going to show you just a little bit of clip of what it was like.
These are the Muslim prisoners of Umarska.
No, we're running out of time, so let's just.
These are the Muslim prisoners of Umarska. In small groups under heavy Serbian guard, They are ushered into the canteen for a single meal of the day.
Sorry about that. Let's switch it down.
Most have been here for 2 months. They say they don't know why, but they will. USA! USA!
We'll go back to the USA a second. Sorry about that. The point about the cameraman was that he was filming the inmates, and they'd been told that they would be murdered if they said anything to us that upset the Serbs. And there was a second cameraman there who was working for Bosnian television. Because Bosnian television, the local TV station, also sent a crew to the camps. And they were there to do a different story. I've seen their story because it came out in the court action that later came as a result of our piece. And the story they told was that a British television crew had gone to see how humanely the Bosnian Serbs were treating refugees. Now that story's a lie, but that is indeed what the Bosnian Serbs wanted people to believe. So if you are in a world where you don't send Ian Williams and Penny Marshall, if you're in a world where you rely on local journalism, on this occasion, if you'd rung up Bosnian Serb TV and said, look, there's unconfirmed reports of atrocities in Ternopily, Omarska, and Keraterm camps, because the prisoners had been at another camp called Keraterm, which was another death camp, and they'd been moved out from that just before we arrived. If you'd rung Bosnian Serb TV, they would have gone and done that story, and they'd have given you a story that there was nothing to worry about, that everyone was happy, and that refugees have been treated with great humanity. And it would have been a pack of lies. So although I'm very keen that organizations work closely with local journalists, and there are many, many brave local journalists in every part of the world who'll tell you the truth, who'll take risks to get you stories, you have to know who you're dealing with all the time before you trust somebody else to do what you can do by first-hand reporting. And I don't think there's any substitute for first-hand reporting, which is why I'm going to run you a few seconds of this.
For 4 years, we have witnessed turmoil in America, but nothing quite like this. The pro-Trump crowd fought with the police.
Right. Robert Moore says the pro-Trump crowd fought with the police. I can't see you all, but I would assume that if I asked you how many people think that crowd was pro-Trump, most of you put your hand up. The reality is about a quarter of the US population believes that this is what's called a false flag operation, that all these people are actually left-wing provocateurs who've been used to stage an invasion of the Capitol, to discredit the one and only leader, the man who won the election, Donald Trump. So in that world of madness, you do need a reporter to walk through the door as he did with them.
Through their lines, intoxicated by the unlikely prospect of reversing America's election outcome. We watched as the standoff continued for at least an hour. Tear gas canisters were fired from the very stage on which Joe Biden will be inaugurated. But for Capitol Hill police officers, this was a losing battle. This is exactly what was feared, but in no way is this a surprise. It has been fueled by the president's rhetoric, and it's increasingly clear this election has not healed the wounds. It has simply amplified them.
Right, this is just a great piece of television journalism. It doesn't matter that Robert's quite a mature guy. It doesn't matter that he's white. It could have been Clive Myrie. It could have been anybody. It doesn't matter. What matters is the quality of the journalism. And I think that in the end, there is no substitute for really good people. David was very accurate, I thought, in his analysis of why Robert got away with it and wasn't beaten up or even worse by the crowd. He played on the fact that he was British, and I think they thought he was independent. They thought he was neutral. He also knew quite a few of them because he'd actually been reporting in various parts of the United States on the people who believed the election had been stolen and on the militia. So when he ran into some of them, they recognized him. But I think the interesting thing about Robert's story is not just that it was an amazing scoop, but that he was the only person there. And if you've read his piece in his chapter in the book I've recently edited on populism, you'll see that he's got some very interesting ideas on what is going wrong with American journalism. Essentially, there's been a decline of frontline reporting. If you watch these events, as I did on 24-hour news channels that day, nobody apart from Robert was inside. Yes, there were a few blogs. The New York Times did a very good job pulling together all the bloggers and independent film that was available. Do you know how long it took them to assemble it in order to put it on the New York Times website? It took them 6 months to track down all the video. Robert's piece was on the air that night. So I think using other people's sources as opposed to the resources of an international news organization just slows you down. Secondly, people are now incredibly polarized. Robert showed that in his interviews with the people who were inside the Capitol. But the polarization in America now means that nobody believes Fox News if you are on the Democrat side of the argument, and nobody believes CNN or NBC if you're on the Trump side of the argument. So that great ability of these major news brands, Reuters, the BBC, CNN, to report things and hope that people will believe at least most of it, has been destroyed in America. People just don't believe the news anymore. They only believe the news if it tells them what they already think they know. And conspiracy theories and lies, like the lie about who won the election, lies like the lie about who was actually in the Capitol that day, are held to be the truth by a quarter of the population of a sophisticated country. And we've also seen, and these events are part of a most obvious part of it in the United States, but it's growing around the world, the malign influence of populism. And I'm just going to end by showing you just 3 examples of why you should support international journalism. This is Viktor Orban, who runs Hungary. Reporters Sans Frontières accurately call him an enemy of press freedom. He now controls Hungarian television. The newspapers are in the hands of business groups who support him. This is Jair Bolsonaro, president of Brazil. Article 19, South America say press freedom in Brazil is in crisis. The newspapers are almost all owned by groups who support him, and he's intimidating the journalists in the broadcast channels as well. This is President Erdogan. Reporters Sans Frontières say he's a press freedom predator and he controls all the leading media groups. What he's done is he's forced the independent newspaper groups to sell their newspapers to his friends, and he now controls Turkish television. Now, I'm not saying that local journalists, brave local journalists, I'm not saying that bloggers, I'm not saying that the community journalism that David has talked about, which is a tremendously important development. I'm not saying that all of these things aren't fighting these very powerful forces. Of course they are. And I admire what they do enormously. And without them, international news organizations would find it very much more difficult to operate. But the notion that you're going to get accurate, independent, fearless reporting in these countries without the resources and the reach of global news organizations, I think is now in some question. And so I will leave you with 2 thoughts. One very serious and one slightly more frivolous. If you want me to answer the question, do foreign correspondents have a problem? That is my answer. As long as they continue to adapt to changes in technology and society, they will remain a vital source of accurate, independent journalism with global impact. Not the only source, not a perfect source, not a source that doesn't still require, as David has rightly pointed out, really significant reform and modernization and openness to diversity of thought and view and of people. Not a perfect source, but a vital one nonetheless. And finally, I don't know if any of you are have followed the TV series Game of Thrones, which is a fantasy series about a Manichaean world of a battle between good and evil. And there's a scene towards the end where two of the protagonists meet with the world in great peril, humanity in peril. And one of the protagonists has the chance actually to have his revenge and execute the other, who's been a thorn in his flesh throughout the series. It's Jon Snow and Jaime Lannister. And when he's asked whether this man should be executed, he said, no, we need all the men we can get. So my final thought for you is this, that if you agree with me, with the Washington Post's slogan that democracy dies in darkness, we need all the reporters we can get. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. That's very kind.
So there you have it. Questions. Thank you very much, Richard. Somebody once used the analogy. In fact, I know who it was when I was interviewing. It was the great Robert Drew, the founder of a format called Cinema Verite. When I was doing my PH, he very kindly spoke to me. He said, which I should use it here, he says, we're the same beasts, but slightly different animals coming from it from different sides. So we're still, we're arguing the same thing when it's on.
Absolutely.
So there we go. But as I say, there are various caveats. Questions, please, because all of this feeds into your knowledge. Questions for Professor Tait? Anyone? Please. You say it and I'll repeat it to him. Otherwise, you can come down here and speak to him yourself. What do you want to do?
I'll just say it.
Okay.
I agree with the fact that it's great reporting talent, as you said, but there was the evidence of that black police officer Eugene Goodman, who actually got raped like throughout his physical race. So do you think a different reporter would have had a different experience?
Ooh, okay, tricky. You know what? I really wish you'd address Richard personally, because that's a really good one, and I don't want to reinterpret what you said. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes, yes, yeah, because it's such a good question. It's somehow I dilute it when it's me saying it to you. That's agency. That's called agency. You say what you need to say yourself. So there's Richard. Yeah.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. With Moore's reporting of the January 6th riots, even though I completely agree that it was good reporting and that anyone else could have done good reporting on it, there's actual evidence of harassment due to race. So Eugene Goodman, who was a Capitol police officer, and he got targeted because of his race. So do you think a different reporter may have had a different experience with that crowd?
Well, I think that's a really good question. Very, very good question. I think any American reporter who had gone in there would have been taking a big chance, whether they were a black reporter or a white reporter or a Latino reporter. There were American journalists beaten up outside the Capitol complex itself. And I think safety was one of the reasons why they didn't go in. In the case of Robert, the reason he, I've talked to him quite a bit about this, the reason he got away with it, if you like, is first of all, he's incredibly experienced, and he knew where there were dangerous people in there, and they kept away from the really dangerous people. A lot of the people there were just, dare I say it, useful idiots. They were being led. They were quite insincere. I mean, he showed that in the interviews. They were sort of, they genuinely believed they were saving American democracy. They were being manipulated by some very evil people. And Robert was sufficiently experienced because he'd worked with on these stories to keep clear of them. He had a very good woman reporter who was, producer who was very good at defusing situations and also watched his back and the cameraman's back. The cameraman was Irish and had worked in tense situations all around the world and is a lovely guy and a very, very sort of personable man. The producer's a very charming, but very determined lady. And it's just professionalism. They weren't aggressive. They weren't in anybody's face. They did challenge them. But I think you're right. I think an American reporter might have been more rhetorical. How can you justify doing this? Or something like that, which could have resulted in being kicked to pieces. And so you're absolutely right. Not everybody could do it. Could Clive Murray have done it? Actually, I think Clive could. I think Clive's a brilliant reporter. And I don't think they would have turned on him just because his family came from Jamaica. I think he could have handled it. I think and that's my whole point of it. I do think that international reporting should be open to everybody, and increasingly it is. Trevor went to some of those difficult and dangerous parts of the world where you would say, are you sure you're going all right there, Trevor? And Trevor knew how to handle himself. He's a clever, charming, unaggressive, but persistent sort of man. It's very hard to have a row with him. And Robert's like that. He's just very, very cool and calm. So I think it's about how they handle themselves. But the other thing I would say, and this is why I'm so passionate about international reporting continue, is I've known Robert since he joined ITN as a graduate trainee. When ITN nearly went bust, the one thing we did was he hung on to our international reporters because the BBC wanted to pinch them all. He's been there for 40 years. Very nearly. He's just a brilliant, experienced person. And in these things, experience does help. It's great to see the new generation coming up. They're really good as well, but years of experience does help in a situation like that. Probably it was better that he'd been around the block a few times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great question, though. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you. And race culture is always a very complex issue, and what Professor Tait said was absolutely correct and bang on when he said he's spoken to Clive, as I have, who became correspondent in Japan. And Clive tells a brilliant story where only once did he face racism when the CEO, instead of talking to him, was speaking to his camera person. But beyond that, everything was fine. I remember my first job at Newsnight in 1990, and the editor then was a guy called Tim Gardam. When I walked through the door and I sat down, he called me to his office. His exact words were this: "I hope you're not here thinking you're going to do black stories only." And I went, "Good heavens, of course not, because that's not what I wanted to do."
Exactly.
I wanted to be amongst the best as well. So, my going to South Africa was to report from different sides. I reported from AWB members as much as in the townships, but there's something that Professor Tait alludes to, which is hugely important. And I can't find the right word for it, so I just use this word. There's an element of streetwise in what you're doing, that experience matters, but how do you get your experience in the first place?
Yep.
And the thing about international reporting is you need to be a bit sussed and a bit wily and a bit streetwise about where you're going, what you're doing, when you land, who do you speak to. I go native very quickly. I will go into a bar, have a drink, find someone, have a chat. They'll look at me very strangely and think, "Oh, black guy with a British accent, where are you from?" And before you know it, we've got a bit of a friendship and I've got someone who's going to help me out. So there's a wiliness about it. So, you know, but race sometimes in a calculable way on some stories can turn things around. There's a very famous interview between a guy called Trevor Phillips and one of our MPs, Norman Tebbit, back in the day, where he asks him the cricket question.
Yep.
Whose side do you think I should be, you know, batting on? And could I live next door to you? So those can be purposeful, but ultimately, yes, it will be about experience. And I think the question that Professor Tait also raises at the end is a hugely important one. He says, if we adapt, this is the key question. If you can adapt to both the cultures and the technology, then the idea of international reporting, which I firmly believe in as well, has a place, because you do need to know about other places. But the question still begs the idea of what might this place look like in 70 years, with technology perhaps way beyond our comprehension, with ultimately AI dominating the landscape. That's going to happen. So we're going to have to adapt to that. And how do we use it? I'll say one thing and then ask another question. We were devising, and I don't mind saying this, working with a guy from Southampton, a very clever guy. We were devising, there were difficulties, but we were devising an interface for TV that meant when someone was talking, you got an idea about who they were connected to and what people were thinking at the same time. So, you know, you could make up your ideas as you go along. Anyway, another question, please. Yes. Okay, well, if you say it one time and then I'll try and interpret it or say the same thing back to you.
It's just one question. I think it's about the obstacles of foreign news reporters. One is from the journalism production perspective, and also one is from the international perspective. The first one thing is about, just like we know the foreign news reporter is about from somebody to get rid of other information asymmetry and also to bring news that's from international level back to your country. And I think one is that maybe foreign news reporters, you cannot be beyond the limitation of your own media, for example, like in CGT, and you cannot be beyond the principle of Chinese journalism rules. But if you just, I think also journalism is about to select, use different sources from a very big cases.
Okay, stop there for a moment, and I'm going to tell you, why is everyone laughing? Why are you laughing? Go on. Please tell me, you know the answer, because it's going to be very difficult for me to relay what he's saying. So in academic terms, we either say, if you're going to make a statement, absolutely go for it, but come to the floor, or if it's a short question, I can do that for you. Which is the one that you want to do? Thank you, fantastic. And that was my streetwise playing up there.
Hello, Professor. Here's the question. It's about the obstacles that foreign news reporters are facing. It's about about the journalism production process. Many foreign news reporters, they cannot go beyond the principle of these media's principles and rules, so they cannot be beyond editors' will. So every time when you just report something, when there's a big cases, you just want to gather information from all the sides, this side and the side, maybe for like the United States, one from Republican side, one from the Democratic side. But because maybe it is a news-based, it is foreign news that supported the Republican side, though the editor does not want to gather information from the Republican side, celebrities and KOL. So how can you just cut down these resources from this side if you're a foreign news reporter? And second one is that we know that journalism cannot be beyond politics. So sometimes journalism is like a weapon of politics. For example, like the trade war between Chinese and United States. You know, like the United States sanctioned Chinese by deposit exile or the journalists from China based in the United States. Also, China just sanctioned back United States, but despite all the journalists based in China, like New York Times. So how can we just to be the foreign news journalist that can just overcome the obstacles by just like the politics weapons about that?
No, well, it's a very, very good question to which there's not an easy answer, because what you're really asking about is, how do you define impartiality?
Yeah.
And I think my definition of impartiality is slightly different. I think that one of the ways that you do is by taking your journalism out of the rhetoric of the debate between the two sides. Because what happens in most international situations, and we've seen it, for example, you can see it in relation to America and China at present, which are where the rhetoric on both sides has been ramped up by both sides. What I think good journalism is to do is to look at the underlying issues. I mean, you look at a similar situation between Britain and France. Currently, relations between Britain and France are very, very bad. There's apparently a report today that President Macron has been calling British Prime Minister a numbskull and a liar, and he doesn't like him. Now, there's two sorts of journalism. There's a journalism that goes with that sort of rhetoric. And if you do that, I agree with you, it's very difficult as a journalist to explain to the audience what's really going on. My advice is that, and what most international journalists try to do, is they try and look at what the underlying issues are and report the facts. Now, if you take China and America, part of the issue is about economic power, part of the issue is about strategic interests in the Pacific. You need to try and analyze the underlying issues, and to try to do that as objectively as you can without getting caught up with the rhetoric of the both sides. Similarly, currently between France and Britain, there are some real issues. There's an issue about fish, about Brexit, about migrants. The reporter shouldn't get involved in the name calling. The reporter should look at the underlying issues. So my advice is you go to other sources from politicians, go to academics, go to experts, go to business people or union leaders, or people who are actually living the experience of what the issue is, and report it, if you like, from a less politicized perspective. Because politics is a very polarizing business at present.
Yes, agree with that. Another case is that last week I just talked with my Nigeria friend, classmate, about, because there are many also African journalists that are based in China for Chinese media, but actually they can cover a lot of news that are based in China and bring it back to Africa. But the Chinese media may limit them from bring any information that opposed to Chinese standpoint back to their country. So they're really strongly limited by the media style. So how to overcome it if you are a foreign journalist based in another country to report the foreign news back to your country?
It's very difficult. I think the only way you can do it, and the best international reporters do this, is you find other sources. You talk to experts, you talk to civic leaders, you talk to people outside of, if you like, you don't just talk to politicians. I think too much modern journalism is about politicians, and politicians are very short term. They have their own agendas. Not to say politicians aren't really important, but I think if you have an excessive focus on politicians rather than on real issues, economic issues, geopolitical issues, environmental issues, these are the things that are going to transform our world. Economic growth, climate change, dealing with the pandemic. You can't cover these stories just by reporting political rhetoric.
But many news, they have been politicized. Okay. Thank you, Professor.
Very welcome. A good question. Thank you.
Very good. I'm aware that people are getting itchy feet. Thank you very much. I'm just going to add to what Professor Tait said. And of course, I defer to his knowledge all the while. Impartiality is not about being partial to a story. It's about trying to stand outside of it, which is very different from areas of like what objectivity is and what being subjective is to a story. The information that you have, how you act upon that. But there's something else that we very rarely speak about, and it comes into play into journalism in ways that doesn't become obvious if you're from a monoculture, and that is your own values. Your own values that you have when you bring them to journalism, first and foremost, you're either going to challenge those, or depending on the environment you're in, you're going to reinforce those. So if you come from Ghana, Nigeria, China, you come with your own values. You've had 20 years of being told about the world that you live in. So it becomes highly problematic unless, that is, you're willing to give and engage in this idea, which is a social science, of how you make sense of things in a way that challenges your own beliefs. And it's a difficult thing because social science doesn't have exact answers. The square root of 4 in social science isn't 2. And I talk as a scientist, my first degree. And that's problematic. But the whole point of being in environments like this is that you're having this discussion that hopefully enables you to self-critique. I've maintained for a while that things like race and culture should be integral to journalism courses. Psychology should be integral because of what people are doing to us right now in gaslighting us. History is incredibly important to understand what's gone on in the past. That becomes part of your luggage, your portmanteau, your own toolkit. And those things are things you might independently want to gather while you're on courses like this. In my previous life, at my other university, I drove it, and these were things I kept on pushing, because this idea of what we know in journalism at the surface, going forward, we could do better by going deeper, bringing the debates that you have here about what it's like in China, Russia, Africa, and the rest, and trying to figure that out. That's really it. Richard, your last words as we wrap up, because I can see it's 6 minutes past and people have busy lives.
Yep. No, well, thank both the questioners for very, very good questions, and I've really enjoyed this session. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
I have indeed. So on that note, can we have a round for Professor Tait? Thank you. Okay, so on that point, thank you all very much. I hope this has given you an insight into the sort of discursiveness of the debate and how you might forge your own opinions. I go back to what I said to you earlier on, that in those teams that you were in week 3, if you take some of this and you say, let me do a bullets with my colleagues, and then let's take the best one or put something together, and let's bring that next week, and or just send it to David and see what his feedback is. Because that one thing perhaps we all agree with, that perhaps hasn't been said, is that journalism, and the person who says this more than ever is a guy called Professor Jeff Jarvis from CUNY. It is a conversation. It's an ongoing conversation. It isn't a one-stop, here's what I've got to come up with, and that's the end of it. It is a conversation, so let's continue with that conversation. So next week you have a very well-known correspondent who's going to be speaking to you. The week after that you have another well-known BBC correspondent speaking to you. I'll be around afterwards, but like I said, if we can do that, then we can get into some of the questions along your essay that you've been asking. Is that good? Is that all right? All right, great. All right. On that note then, au revoir, arrivederci, bye, ciao, and all the other rest as well. Bye for now.